How's that?
Perfect. Welcome to the webinar, Big Privacy, the New Big Data Privacy Pact with Constellation Research Vice President and Principal Analyst Steve Wilson. In this webinar, we will discuss Big Privacy, the new standard in big data privacy. If you're a digital business, you'll want to use Big Privacy to be transparent with your customers about how you use their data. If you're a customer, you'll want to be informed of Big Privacy so you can get fair value for your data. Big Privacy was conceived by Steve Wilson. Be sure to read his research report about Big Privacy, which is available on the Constellation website. Just as a reminder, this webinar and the slides will be available for download on the Constellation website. Steve will be taking your questions at the end of the webinar, so go ahead and throw those in the chat box. If you're on Twitter, follow along with the hashtag #CRChat. Steve Wilson is Vice President and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research, focusing on digital identity and privacy. All right, Steve.
Thanks, Courtney. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. Courtney, I assume that my slide is okay there?
Yep.
I'm a technologist. I stumbled across privacy about 12 years ago now, after hearing just so many times that privacy is not a technology issue. I looked into this, I found it just wasn't the case. I found that there's a gap between the thinking of my fellow geeks and the privacy profession, which 12 years ago was on the rise. So today there are all sorts of initiatives trying to forge a new technology privacy synthesis. They go by names like privacy engineering and privacy by design. These are really well-meaning efforts, but they can be a bit stilted. They typically overlook the strengths of conventional privacy law, and they can miss an opportunity to engage the engineering mind. Now, this is not politically correct, but I believe we must admit that privacy is full of contradictions and conflicting requirements. So the reason privacy has become such a hot topic is there's this new gold rush. Last time we had a real gold rush, it saw the creation of new laws and social institutions like security firms and banks and financial regulators. Now, the information gold rush, we think, is going to be just as momentous. We live in a world where billionaires are self-made on the back of nothing more than information. The modern world is awash with data. It's a new, infinitely reusable raw material. Most of this data is actually an invisible byproduct of the way that we go about our digital lives. We leave behind gigabytes of data. Ordinary folk don't even perceive this, let alone understand it. Now, many digital businesses proceed on the basis that all of this raw data is up for grabs. And today, I'm going to try and show you that that assumption is naive. Existing data protection in many countries turns out to be surprisingly powerful in the face of big data. Data miners ignore international privacy perils at international laws. They ignore international laws at their peril. On the other hand, orthodox privacy management just does not cope well with the way new information can be synthesized tomorrow from all of the raw data we collect today. So my presentation is going to try and bridge the gap between data analytics and privacy, and I'm going to outline this new compact that we call Big Privacy to meet the challenges of big data. Now, as I go, I'd encourage you to pose any questions on Twitter at the hashtag #CRChat, and we'll come back to those later. Now, it's often said that technology has outpaced privacy law, but that's not the case. I think that technology has outpaced decency, but privacy law is surprisingly robust. The question, is privacy dead, is over 100 years old. In 1890, dear mind, legal pioneers Warren and Brandeis, they were exercised by the new technologies of photography and the telegraph. In 1970, which is where this Newsweek cover comes from, that's 40-something years ago, Newsweek highlighted the risks being brought about by computers and mass communication and databases. And today, we have a wide range of interested parties casting fresh doubts on privacy. But I say that if we've been asking the same rhetorical question, is privacy dead, for over 40 years, then surely the answer is no. The OECD in 1980 set out privacy principles that still serve us well today. The OECD core privacy principles are that we should not collect more personal information than we need. We should tell individuals what information is being collected about them and why. We should not use personal information collected for one reason for another unrelated reason. And we should not disclose personal information to unrelated parties. Now, I've highlighted collection limitation here in red for two reasons. I believe it's the most basic privacy measure, but I think it's also the most problematic, not least because it's more or less absent in US privacy thinking, and I'll come back to that point later. Now, outside the US at least, rights-based privacy law has had some really significant victories against technologies that were barely imagined when these OECD principles were drawn up. So we'll look at a couple of examples. Google Street View cars, while they're driving up and down photographing the streetscapes, also look out for Wi-Fi hubs in homes and offices and public places, and they add these hub locations to their geolocation database. Now that's all fine, but in 2010 it was found out more or less by accident that the Street View cars were also collecting Wi-Fi network traffic. Some of that traffic was unencrypted, and therefore it contained personal information like usernames, even bank account details and passwords in some cases. In Australia, the Netherlands, Korea and elsewhere, privacy commissioners investigated, and the privacy commissioners found that Google was in breach of local data protection laws. Many technologists have argued that Wi-Fi data is in the public domain and it's not private. And they say that by definition, they like to say, by definition, Wi-Fi data could not be private. But look, I'm here today to say that they're wrong. This is paradoxical, it's counterintuitive, but the argument about the public domain fails to grasp a technicality that data protection laws basically do not distinguish public from private. What matters in data protection laws is identifiability. If data is identifiable, and if individuals have not consented to collection, then the privacy conditions attach. In 2012, we saw Facebook's facial recognition running afoul of European data privacy laws. When users tag themselves or their friends in photos, Facebook creates biometric templates, and these are subsequently used by the company to identify people in all of the other photos in its vast databanks. Tag suggestions is a really neat feature. It automatically identifies people in your photos. The privacy problem here is that the generation of tag suggestions represents an indirect collection of personal information. When Facebook's biometric processes make a putative match and record a name against what was anonymous image data, then Facebook has collected personal information. European regulators found this to be a serious breach, and in late 2012 they forced Facebook to shut down all of its facial recognition and destroy its biometric templates in Europe. And I reckon that that was really quite a show of force over one of the most powerful companies in our digital age. The lesson here for big data privacy is it doesn't matter if you infer personal information almost out of thin air. Even if you're using sophisticated analytics to make these deductions, you're still subject to privacy principles and regulations. And again, use the hashtag #CRChat if you've got any questions, and we'll come back to that in 10 minutes or so. Collection limitation, as I said, is the cornerstone of data privacy. If you don't need a piece of personal information, then you really have no cause to keep it. Now, this is the conceptual cousin of the foundations of data security, right? The need to know principle and the principle of least privilege are essentially the same as collection limitation. This is therefore the best starting point. I think it's the only rational starting point for what we call privacy by design. All new digital projects should begin with rigorous analysis of what personal information is really needed for their business, and then they should restrict themselves accordingly on the need-to-know basis. And it bears repeating that the collection principle is generally technology neutral. It's blind to the method of collection. Collection limitation applies whether personal information is collected directly by questionnaire or indirectly via facial recognition or data mining. We talk about data mining, and we think it's really more about data refining. You can imagine the industrial process now of image analysis that takes raw photo data and is able through algorithms to deduce location, identities through biometrics, associations. It deduces what you like because these algorithms can see what you're doing, who you're doing it with, when and where you're doing it. It can see you hanging out at cafes. It can see you going to the movies. And in future, you're not going to have to ever expressly press like in a social network ever again. It's going to know what you like. Now, this is where big data does create challenges for conventional privacy practices. Data miners just don't know what they're actually going to find. Now, the conventional privacy policy sets out what personal information is collected, why it's collected, how and when it's collected. But with the best will in the world, as I said, a data mining outfit who wants to be transparent is still going to find it difficult to specify upfront all of the personal details that they might be extracting from raw data down the track. So a typical privacy policy will outline the demographics of the people concerned. It will state up front that we're going to track your preferences. It will describe the method of collection through forms and questionnaires and maybe shopping history. And it will outline when and where the data is collected through the sign-up process, the routine transactions, through your marketing transactions, and so on. We think a big privacy policy needs to go another step. Instead of articulating what we know, we should in fact start talking about what we could know and bring users into our confidence and describe what we might be deducing from the raw data. Now, how we know it is a rich and ever-evolving landscape. We have data analytics, we've got biometrics, we've got social media, and the Internet of Things, of course, is bringing ubiquitous sensors. When and where are we collecting this? Well, it's 24/7. It's not just at the time that the raw data is being picked up, but it's also on the ongoing basis as the data mining and the data analytics algorithms are working through the night. So with big data, the privacy policy can't be frozen. It needs to be a dialogue. It needs to be dynamic. And I don't just refer to the notorious shifting privacy policies of those big infomopolies. The privacy policy is changing all the time thanks to the reality of the unknown. So we call for a new privacy compact between organisations and individuals. More than ever, in the face of big data's temptations, remember that privacy is about restraint. It's not only what we do with personal data, just as important what we choose not to do. Modern businesses often reserve the right to do whatever they like with customers' digital byproducts, but respect for customers means drawing a line. Super transparency. If basic data privacy means being open about personal information, advanced privacy means going even further and telling customers more about your business models and the big data tools and the sorts of results that data mining is expected to return. And a fair deal for personal information, or PII. Customers and companies will do much better if they engage in a real deal that sets out what data is really worth and offers a fair price for it. Privacy advocates often say that, privacy is good for business, and it's a well-meaning slogan, but we have to admit that this is pretty tough. Privacy does create real tensions for many businesses. The biggest tension that lies ahead is the price of restraint. If privacy is what we don't do with personal information, then big privacy brings an opportunity cost. If businesses are serious about privacy, then they're actually going to have to willingly forego some of the potential riches that are gained from hanging on to all of that data. So we call on companies, businesses, organisations, governments to firstly exercise restraint. In the US, this probably involves a self-imposed collection limitation. In respecting users' privacy, businesses should be prepared, as I say, to forego some potential returns. Secondly, we need to be super transparent. We should bring users into our confidence. We should fully explain the benefits of big data. We should spell out how we value their personal information and how we go about extracting it. And thirdly, let's engage users in this fair deal. Now, as a baseline, I assume that most businesses are broadly telling people what they know about them in a privacy policy. But to build trust and participation in big data, it's a good idea to also tell people what you might know about them. Now, some businesses are already providing what we call personal information dashboards. So the users can actually see what's known about them, and they can see what's being worked out about them. And in future, I see personal information dashboards letting users monitor and actually control how their information stacks up, and maybe having the opportunity to opt into big data processes and opt out again, and then opt back in again as that value proposition continues to evolve and as people continue to understand what's in it for them. Now, I've touched on the word tension several times today, and I really use that word deliberately. Privacy is not a bowl of cherries. We need to be quite mature about this. Just as there's no such thing as perfect security, I say we can never have perfect privacy either. And this is where the professional engineering mindset should be brought in to deal with conflicting requirements. It's what real-world engineering is all about. If we're serious about so-called privacy by design, then we need to acknowledge these tensions. And that's the thinking that's behind our Big Privacy Compact. To balance privacy and big data, we need to have a conversation with users that respects the stresses and strains and involves them in working through this new big privacy deal. I've recently been looking at privacy policies for some of the new live camera services, for example, and some of these services don't even have privacy policies. So I guess I'd encourage people to go back today, have a look at the privacy undertakings, the promises, the privacy policies at your organisations, and make sure that you're giving a reasonable account of what information you collect and why. And then look forward, if you're involved with big data, if you're planning data analytics, take that broader view and have a look at what you might know about people and think about how you're going to represent that. Thanks very much, and Courtney, we might take some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And it looks like we do have a few questions here. Again, if you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat box or tweet us at CRChat. And if you're just joining us, we're at the tail end of this webinar. Steve Wilson just covering big privacy. And with big data, businesses are scooping up data from consumers and archiving it until they can determine how they should analyze it. And while there's huge potential in analyzing the data, businesses need to respect the privacy of their customers and provide their customers fair value in exchange for this data. And this, as Steve has been talking about, means entering into a pact with your customers, which he's termed big privacy, which calls on companies to practice restraint, transparency, and offer, as we've been saying, fair value in exchange for personal data. And big privacy is really an open conversation between businesses and the consumer. So now to our questions. The first one, have you any practical suggestions for doing privacy by design?
Practical suggestions, indeed. Look, privacy by design, I guess, is it's been the concept's been around for about 10 years. It's really just a re-expression of privacy principles, and we do need to take the well-meaning privacy design to the next step of having some practical design and analysis tools. I've talked about conflicting requirements, and privacy is, this is not politically correct. People usually like to think that privacy is all good, but it does create tensions with security, for example. A security person or a legal mindset will often look at an IT system and wish to log everything that we possibly can for forensic purposes or for, just in case the information is needed one day. The privacy mindset is to say, don't hang on to personal information if you don't need it. And if there's a grey area about what you might do with personal information for forensic or security purposes, monitoring and reporting, you need to flesh out those tensions and the conflicting requirements. So privacy by design, I think, involves at the analysis stage bringing legal, security, risk, marketing, and privacy people together, just as you do with any sort of requirement. There could be a cost performance trade-off or a security cost trade-off or a security convenience trade-off. Well, I say to people they need to be looking at the privacy security trade-off and fleshing those issues out early on. It's also possible to do a privacy risk analysis in the same way that we do a security threat risk analysis. A lot of people will be familiar with the concept of identifying the conceivable threats, the foreseeable threats to an organization, like external hacking, internal failures, power outages, earthquakes, rogue employees. And security professionals look at these things and they estimate the likelihood of something bad happening and the impact of something bad happening. And there are good methodologies for combining likelihood and impact, coming up with a risk rating, and then prioritizing countermeasures to look at the high priority risks. And we've developed ways of doing the same thing with privacy by looking at privacy specific risks like international compliance risks, confidentiality breaches, privacy complaints, and factoring those into the same sort of security analysis that you do at the early stage of a project. So those are some practical tools for doing privacy by design.
Okay, great. So I guess, just really simplistically, privacy by design means gathering all the stakeholders together at the very beginning of projects to determine how to use, archive, and delete data in a way that balances the requirements of business and privacy. And it sounds like there's always going to be some kind of a trade-off.
Yeah,
And
that's
that,
right, Courtney. And we should be mature about this. Like, there's no such thing as perfect privacy. And we don't expect perfect security anymore. So I encourage organizations to treat privacy as a design exercise and make some assumptions about it, write down the assumptions, and then revisit these things every 12 months as you do the rest of your design. And then you'll be in much better shape when a privacy breach occurs. And maybe somebody gets upset because they've figured out that you've been logging their shopping history for the last 3 years. And it's a very bad response to a breach to say, look, we were just doing that because we thought the information might be handy one day. That's a very bad response. A much better response is to say to people, well, we log information for the following forensic purposes, for data analytics, and we promise that we delete information after 12 months, for example. So you make those sorts of decisions and you move forward.
got it. Okay, so we do have another question coming in from Twitter, and this listener is struggling to articulate the value proposition for self-imposed collection limitation.
Well, there's always, in this day and age, there's always a soft answer and a hard answer. The hard answer is that collection limitation is the law in many places outside the US. So we encourage multinational companies to think about the position they're in Europe, in much of Asia and Australia, New Zealand. So that's the sort of hard answer, it's the compliance answer. The softer, more sort of constructive, creative answer has got to do with the sort of relationship that you want to have with your customers. Maybe put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself whether or not it's reasonable to have excessive personal information about yourself collected by airlines and retailers and so on. Now, quite often, and I'm optimistic and I'm positive, or I'm a half full person, if you like, instead of half empty. The vast majority of these big data exercises do produce a win-win in terms of better customer outcomes and services. The trick here is to be transparent about it and to make sure that you're not surprising your customers with excessive personal information gathering. So the proposition is to respect your customers, to be upfront about the fact that you value their personal information and you may be generating secondary value from it, and offer them a fair deal. Make sure they understand what you're collecting and why, and take the broad view. Make sure that you understand that data analytics is just an indirect form of collection. If you can work out somebody's shopping preferences or their movie preferences from their shopping habits, then that's a form of collection, and you shouldn't be doing it if you can't show why. Uh, I just want to make another point about health information too. There's the infamous case a couple of years ago where the Target department store was found to be using data analytics to predict if a customer was pregnant. And this is a pretty grey area of privacy law that we're getting into now. I put it to you that if you are running data analytics to work out health information about people, then you may not be up against the HIPAA regulations, but if you're deducing health information from shopping habits, then that's something that really does need to be limited to do the right thing by the customer, to not surprise them, and to make sure that you are yourself not getting into some sort of health information compliance problem.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So I guess the hard answer there was compliance. The softer, more creative answer is that we are looking to build a nice, healthy, trusting relationship with our customers. And if you're just tuning in, we are discussing Big Privacy with Steve Wilson. Big Privacy is a manifesto calling on digital businesses to temper their use of your, as a consumer, personal data. The main point here is that there needs to be an element of self-regulation and restraint. And Big Privacy calls for an open dialogue between digital businesses and customers about the way they analyze data. And what we just touched on there is that customers are becoming increasingly savvy about how businesses use their data and benefit from it. And so in the long run, transparency will benefit you as a company, whether that means creating a more trusting relationship with the customer or resulting in greater sales. And it looks like there's I think we have time for one more question really quickly. This one is more timely. Do you have any comments on the recent right to be forgotten case against Google in Europe? And Steve, if you could go into a little bit of background about that right to be forgotten case as well.
Yes, look, we could talk about this for a long time, so we'll try and keep this crisp. The right to be forgotten it's like a civil liberties argument that it would be better for people all around if the internet didn't hang on to everything forever. So we have the classic case of you might be an enthusiastic teenager, you've done something that all teenagers do, you've put it on Facebook, and fast forward 10 years, you're applying for a job, and you've gone through college, and you're a fine, upstanding person with a blemish on your record, and it would be unfortunate if these things from your deep past are revisited in a sort of a disproportionate way. So it's a fine idea in practice, but of course the internet does tend to remember things. But moreover, there are more and more tools for digging deep and finding out things from people's deep distant past. So what's happened recently, just a few weeks ago, the European Court of Justice ruled on a long-standing case where a particular individual had brought a complaint against Google for Google's search results bringing up a surprising and unfortunate fact about this individual. The Court of Justice ruled that Google as a search engine is not just a passive relay of ones and zeros from memory banks, but Google is a more active participant, and therefore, in principle, Google is accountable for the way that it presents information in its search engine. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm only going to give you my non-legal interpretation. I would really encourage people to go and find lots of reporting, non-legal, non-technical reporting about this case is out there, and I'd really encourage you to look deep, because there's a lot of sort of stereotyping going on about the court being naive with respect to technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, privacy advocates are saying, this is actually not a case about the right to be forgotten. but it's a more pragmatic case about how search engines work. Now, my own belief about this is that if you are a big data miner or a data analytics service provider, and you've developed algorithms that can look deeply into the past and can evaluate information, organize information. I mean, Google um, has a mission to organize the world's information. So it's not a passive process. These search engines involve algorithms that sort and evaluate and make, they bring to the surface data that you otherwise wouldn't find. I mean, that's the value proposition. These services find information and bring it to the surface that you couldn't do otherwise. And to that extent, I believe it's probably correct in principle for Google to be accountable for linking to information that may turn out to be irrelevant or completely inaccurate. Now, the court's ruling is that there is a legal right for users to complain about this. Um, the ruling is really quite nuanced, and again, I'd encourage you to go out and have a look at it. And it in fact resonates with processes that Google already has for takedown notices under copyright infringement. So it's not a radical change. The headlines have been screaming that this is the end of technology, or it's the beginning of privacy, and it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So it sounds like the European courts are kind of moving towards forcing digital businesses to temper the personal data they present on the screen. And I guess maybe the US courts and other international courts might not be far behind. So if you're a digital business, it's time to start on your big privacy initiative. And remember, big privacy means transparency, restraint, and fair value for data. And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Thank you, Steve. Remember that we at Constellation Research are committed to helping our clients realize the potential of new and emerging technologies. And be sure to join us for our next Disruptive Technology webinar.